The dust billowed across the barren landscape as Theodora Russell gripped the reins of her worn mare, sweat beading on her forehead beneath the brim of her father's old hat. She'd been riding for 3 days straight, stopping only when absolutely necessary, her body aching and her heart heavier than the saddlebags draped across her horse. Wyoming Territory, 1875, was no place for a woman alone, but she had no choice. Behind her lay a past soaked in blood and betrayal. Ahead lay uncertainty, but at least it offered the promise of anonymity. The town of Sweetwater Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a collection of wooden structures clinging stubbornly to the earth in defiance of the harsh elements. Theodora adjusted the kerchief around her neck, making sure the scar that curved along her collarbone remained hidden. Some wounds healed with time, but this one, both the physical mark and what it represented, seemed determined to stay raw. As she rode down the main street, the curious glances of townsfolk followed her. Women traveling alone were uncommon enough to draw attention, and attention was exactly what Theodora didn't want. Her father had taught her long ago that eyes that lingered too long eventually started asking questions, and questions were dangerous. She dismounted outside the general store, wincing as her boots hit the ground. Her legs, unused to such extended time in the saddle, protested the sudden change. Tying her mare to the hitching post, she straightened her dusty riding skirt and pushed open the door. The store's interior offered a welcome respite from the relentless sun. A bell jingled overhead, announcing her arrival to the proprietor, a round-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Afternoon, madam," he greeted her, his eyes curious but kind. "What can I help you with today?" "I need supplies," Theodora replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, "and information about work in town." "Well, you've come to the right place for both," he said with a smile. "Name's Samuel Briggs. Own this establishment going on 15 years now." "Theodora Russell," she offered, deciding that in a town this small, withholding her name would only invite more suspicion. "Passing through or looking to stay a while, Miss Russell?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Theodora had learned to hear the curiosity beneath such inquiries. "Depends on the work," she answered noncommittally. Samuel nodded, seeming to understand her caution. "Town's growing. Hotel might need help." The schoolhouse lost their teacher last month, influenza, and Dr. Patterson's been looking for someone to help with his patients. Theodora's ears perked up at the mention of the doctor. She'd assisted a physician back in St. Louis before everything had gone wrong. It was work she knew, work she was good at. "Where might I find Dr. Patterson?" "End of town, white house with green trim. Can't miss it." Samuel began gathering the supplies she requested. "Though, if you don't mind me saying, you might want to get yourself a room and a hot bath first." "Journey looks to have been hard on you." Theodora couldn't argue with that assessment. "The hotel, it's reputable. Mrs. Winters runs a tight ship. No trouble under her roof." After paying for her supplies and getting directions to the hotel, Theodora led her horse down the street. The weight of the past few days and the past few years pressed down on her shoulders. She'd come to Sweetwater Creek hoping for a fresh start, but she knew better than most that the past had a way of trailing behind like a shadow. Mrs. Winters, a stern-faced woman with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, looked Theodora up and down with a critical eye but didn't ask too many questions beyond how long she planned to stay. "A week to start," Theodora replied, placing coins on the counter. "Maybe longer if I find work." "Rooms at the top of the stairs, first door on the right. Bath'll cost you extra, but from the look of you, it'd be money well spent." An hour later, submerged in a copper tub of steaming water, Theodora allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. She scrubbed away the dust from the trail, careful around the scar that ran from her collarbone to her shoulder, a permanent reminder of her last night in St. Louis. As she traced the raised tissue with her fingertips, memories flooded back, unwanted and unbidden. Dr. Richard's face twisted with rage, the glint of the scalpel in the lamplight, her own screams muffled by his hand, and then blood, so much blood as she fought back with a strength born of desperation. She shook her head, sending droplets of water splashing against the wooden walls of the washroom. That was behind her now. Dr. Richard was dead, and she was alive, hundreds of miles away from the life she'd once known. The next morning, dressed in her cleanest clothes, a navy blue skirt and white blouse, Theodora made her way to Dr. Patterson's practice. The white house with green trim stood apart from the other buildings, a small garden of medicinal herbs growing alongside it. She knocked on the door, straightening her posture and preparing the story she'd rehearsed. A partial truth. She had worked for a doctor back east but had to leave due to unfortunate circumstances. The details of those circumstances would remain unspoken. The door swung open to reveal a young man, not the aging doctor she had expected, but someone closer to her own 24 years. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a lean frame. Dark hair fell in slight waves around a face that was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deep and pleasant. Momentarily caught off guard, Theodora cleared her throat. "I'm looking for Dr. Patterson. I was told he might be in need of assistance." "You're looking at him," he replied with a hint of a smile. "Dr. Isaac Patterson, at your service, and you are." "Theodora Russell," she said, extending her hand in what she hoped was a professional manner. "I have experience working with a physician. Mr. Briggs at the general store mentioned you might be seeking help, Doctor." Patterson's handshake was firm but gentle, his hands bearing the calluses of someone who worked hard, but also possessing the careful touch required of a healer. "Sam's right about that. Been running this practice alone since my father passed last year. It's more work than one person can handle properly." He stepped back from the doorway. "Please come in. We can discuss your experience." The interior of the house was divided between a waiting area at the front and what appeared to be an examination room beyond. Everything was meticulously organized, with shelves of medicines and supplies lining the walls. "Have a seat," Dr. Patterson offered, gesturing to a chair next to a small desk. "Where did you train, Miss Russell?" "I worked with Dr. William Richard in St. Louis for 3 years, she answered, the name catching slightly in her throat. "I assisted with examinations, prepared medicines, and tended to patients when he was occupied elsewhere." "St. Louis is a long way from Wyoming," Dr. Patterson observed, studying her with intelligent eyes. "What brings you to Sweetwater Creek?" This was the question Theodora had been dreading, the one that threatened to expose the wound she worked so hard to hide. "A desire for a change of scenery," she replied, the practiced lie falling easily from her lips. "And an opportunity to apply my skills where they're needed." Dr. Patterson nodded slowly, seeming to consider her words. "Medicine out here is different from what you might be used to in the city. Fewer resources, more improvisation. Patients sometimes travel for days to reach us, often in dire conditions." "I understand. I'm prepared for the challenges." "Are you?" he asked, his gaze direct and assessing. "It's not just about medical knowledge, it's about stamina, resilience. This isn't an easy life, Miss Russell." Theodora met his gaze unflinchingly. "I assure you, Dr. Patterson, I am no stranger to hardship. I can handle whatever this position requires." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because after a moment he nodded. "Very well. I can offer you a trial period, 1 week. After that, we'll reassess. The position includes room and board. There's a small apartment above the practice plus a modest salary." Relief washed over her. A job and a place to stay, all in one stroke of good fortune. "Thank you, Dr. Patterson. When would you like me to start?" "How about right now?" he suggested, standing up. "I have patients arriving within the hour. You can observe today, assist tomorrow if all goes well." And just like that, Theodora found herself with a new position in a new town, working alongside a man who, unlike Dr. Richard, seemed to possess both skill and kindness in equal measure. As she hung her hat on the rack by the door, she allowed herself a small moment of hope. Perhaps Sweetwater Creek could indeed be the fresh start she so desperately needed. The first day passed in a blur of introductions and observations. Dr. Patterson, who insisted she call him Isaac, was a capable physician with a gentle bedside manner that put even the most anxious patients at ease. He treated everything from a rancher's broken arm to a child's persistent cough with the same dedicated attention. Theodora watched and learned, noting the differences between his methods and Dr. Richards. Where her former employer had been brusque and often dismissive of patients he deemed beneath his station, Isaac listened carefully to each person who came through his door, taking their concerns seriously. As the last patient departed and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the examination room, Isaac turned to her with a tired but satisfied smile. "What do you think? Still interested in the position after seeing what it entails?" "More than ever," Theodora replied honestly. "You're a good doctor, Dr. Patterson." "Isaac, please," he reminded her, "and thank you, I try to be." He began cleaning instruments, his movements precise and practiced. "You have a good eye. I noticed you caught Mrs. Henderson's symptoms before I mentioned them." Theodora nodded, helping him organize the supplies. The slight yellowing around her eyes suggested jaundice. It's subtle in the early stages, but important to address quickly. "Exactly." He seemed pleased by her observation. "Let me show you to your quarters. You must be tired." The apartment above the practice was small but comfortable, with a bedroom, a modest sitting area, and a small kitchen. Previous occupants had left behind furniture: a bed with a quilt, a table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf with medical texts, giving the space a lived-in feel despite its simplicity. "It's not fancy," Isaac said, watching her reaction, "but it's private and convenient for the work." "It's perfect," Theodora assured him, genuinely pleased with the arrangement. After days on the trail and a night in the hotel, the prospect of a place to call her own was deeply appealing. "I'll leave you to settle in then. There's a separate entrance at the back, so you can come and go as you please. We'll start early tomorrow. First patient arrives at 7. After he left, Theodora unpacked her meager belongings and explored her new home. The window overlooked the main street of Sweetwater Creek, offering a view of the town as it prepared for evening. Lamps were being lit in windows, casting warm glows against the gathering darkness, for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to consider the possibility that she might actually be safe here. She touched the scar beneath her blouse, a habit she'd developed whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. The raised flesh reminded her of how close she had come to death, but also of her own strength, her will to survive. As she prepared for bed, Theodora made a silent promise to herself. She would build a new life here, one day at a time. She would be careful, vigilant, but she wouldn't let fear dictate her every move. Sweetwater Creek offered a chance at redemption, and she intended to grasp it with both hands. The next morning arrived with the crow of a rooster and the soft glow of dawn filtering through her window. Theodora dressed quickly, pinning her honey-brown hair into a neat bun and donning a clean, practical dress. Before heading downstairs, she carefully tied a silk scarf around her neck, ensuring the scar remained hidden. Isaac was already in the examination room when she entered, preparing for the day ahead. He looked up at her entrance, a smile brightening his features. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Sleep well, better than I have in weeks," she admitted. The safety of a locked door and the comfort of a real bed had worked wonders for her rest. "Glad to hear it. We have a full schedule today, starting with old Mr. Jenkins and his rheumatism. I thought you might prepare some willow bark tea before he arrives. He won't take any other medicine, claims it upsets his constitution." Theodora nodded, appreciating being given a task immediately rather than being treated as an observer. As she worked, measuring out the dried bark and setting water to boil, Isaac moved around the room, organizing patient files and checking supplies. "May I ask how you came to be a doctor in Sweetwater Creek?" she inquired, hoping to learn more about her new employer while keeping the conversation away from her own past. Isaac glanced up from his work. "My father was the doctor here for 30 years. I grew up watching him tend to everyone from newborns to the elderly. Went east to medical school, Pennsylvania, then came back to join his practice." A shadow crossed his face. "When he died last year, it fell to me to continue his work." "I'm sorry for your loss," Theodora said softly. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "It was difficult at first, but this is where I belong. These people trusted my father with their lives, and now they trust me. It's a responsibility I take seriously." Before she could respond, a knock at the door announced Mr. Jenkins's arrival. The day unfolded in a steady rhythm of patients, each with their own concerns and ailments. Theodora fell easily into the role of assistant, anticipating Isaac's needs and offering her own insights when appropriate. By mid-afternoon, when there was a lull in appointments, Isaac turned to her with an approving nod. "You're skilled, Theodora. Your previous employer trained you well." The mention of doctor. Richard sent an involuntary shiver down her spine, which she tried to hide by busying herself with organizing supplies. "He was thorough in his teachings," she said carefully. Isaac seemed to sense her discomfort, his expression turning curious. "Is everything all right?" "Of course," she replied quickly, too quickly. "I'm just adjusting to the new environment." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, his blue eyes searching her face as if trying to read the truth behind her words. Finally, he nodded. "Understandable." "It's a big change from city life." The rest of the week passed in much the same manner. Theodora and Isaac fell into an easy working relationship, their skills complementing each other well. She found him to be not only a competent doctor, but also a kind man with a dry wit that often made her smile despite herself. The townspeople, initially curious about the new woman at the doctor's practice, began to accept her presence. She was invited to Sunday services at the small church, welcomed at the general store with friendly greetings, and even received a basket of fresh baked goods from Mrs. Winters at the hotel, who admitted she'd been too harsh during their first meeting. Slowly, cautiously, Theodora began to lower her guard. She still wore high-necked blouses and scarves to conceal her scar, still avoided discussing her past beyond vague references to her medical training, but she allowed herself to enjoy simple pleasures. Conversations over coffee with Isaac between patients, evening walks through town, the satisfaction of helping those in need. On the last day of her trial period, as they closed up the practice after treating a young cowhand who'd been thrown from his horse, Isaac cleared his throat. "So, Theodora, it's been a week." She paused in her cleaning of instruments, her heart suddenly pounding. "Yes, it has." "I think it's safe to say the trial has been successful," he continued, his tone warm. "You've been an invaluable help. I'd like to offer you the position permanently if you're willing to stay in Sweetwater Creek." Relief and joy flooded through her. "I'd be honored to accept," she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Excellent." His own grin matched hers. "In that case, I think this calls for a celebration. Would you join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening, Mrs. Winters serves a stew on Fridays that's the envy of the territory." The invitation caught her by surprise. Was this merely a professional dinner between colleagues, or something more? The way Isaac's ears had reddened slightly suggested the latter, and Theodora was startled to realize she wasn't opposed to the idea. "I'd like that," she replied, surprising herself with her willingness to accept. "Wonderful. Shall we say 7 o'clock?" As Theodora prepared for dinner that evening, she confronted a dilemma she hadn't anticipated: the scar. Her usual high-necked blouses were appropriate for work but too plain for an evening out. Her one nicer dress, a soft green muslin with lace trim that she'd packed on a whim, had a more open neckline that would reveal the mark she'd been so careful to hide. After much deliberation, she put on the green dress and paired it with a delicate lace shawl draped around her shoulders. The arrangement concealed the scar while still allowing her to look more feminine than she had in weeks. She arrived at the hotel restaurant precisely at 7 to find Isaac already waiting. He'd changed from his work clothes into a clean white shirt and dark vest, his hair combed neatly back from his forehead. When he saw her, his eyes widened appreciatively. "Theodora," he greeted her, standing as she approached. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "You clean up rather well yourself, doctor," he laughed, pulling out her chair. "High praise coming from someone who sees me elbow-deep in medical supplies most days." The dinner was more enjoyable than any Theodora had experienced in recent memory. Away from the constraints of their professional roles, she discovered Isaac was not only a skilled physician, but also a man of varied interests. He spoke of books he'd read, places he'd seen during his medical training, and shared humorous stories about growing up in Sweetwater Creek. "What about you?" he asked as they shared a slice of apple pie for dessert. "You've heard all my tales of youthful misadventures. Surely you have some of your own." The question, innocent as it was, caused Theodora to tense. She took a sip of water, buying time to craft a response that wouldn't invite further inquiry. "My childhood was rather uneventful," she said finally. "My father was a carpenter, taught me the value of precision and patience skills that served me well in medicine later. My mother died when I was young, so it was just the two of us until I was 18 and began working for Dr. Richard. And your father now, is he still in St. Louis?" She shook her head, genuine sadness coloring her voice. "He passed away 5 years ago, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Isaac said, his hand moving as if to cover hers before he thought better of it. "It's difficult losing a parent." "It is," she agreed softly. "He was a good man, I miss him still." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Isaac spoke again, his voice gentle. "Theodora, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've noticed you're careful about certain topics. Your past in St. Louis, for instance." Alarm flared within her. Had she been so transparent? "I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not prying," he assured her quickly. "Everyone has things they'd rather not discuss. I just want you to know that, whatever brought you to Sweetwater Creek, you're safe here, with me." The sincerity in his eyes was almost her undoing. For a brief, mad moment, she considered telling him everything the truth about Dr. Richard, about the night that had changed her life forever, about why she had fled hundreds of miles with little more than the clothes on her back. But the moment passed, caution reasserting itself. "Thank you, Isaac," she said instead. "That means more than you know." They walked back to the medical practice together, the night air cool against Theodora's flushed cheeks. The moon hung full above them, casting silver light over the quiet town. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they reached the back entrance to her apartment. "It was a lovely evening." "The first of many, I hope," Isaac replied, his voice warm in the darkness. There was a moment, brief but charged with possibility, when it seemed he might lean in closer, might bridge the small distance between them. But then he stepped back, offering a smile instead. "Good night, Theodora, sleep well." "Good night, Isaac." As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Theodora found herself thinking not of the past she was running from, but of the future that might be possible here in Sweetwater Creek. It was a dangerous thought, one that invited hope, and hope was a luxury she hadn't allowed herself in a very long time. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Theodora and Isaac worked side by side, treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses. Their professional partnership deepened into friendship, punctuated by shared meals, evening walks, and conversations that stretched long into the night. Theodora found herself opening up more, sharing small pieces of her life before Sweetwater Creek, her father's woodworking shop, the books she'd loved as a child, her first experiences assisting with medical procedures. She was careful to avoid mention of Dr. Richard or the events that had led to her flight from St. Louis, but otherwise allowed herself to be more forthcoming than she had been in years. In turn, she learned more about Isaac, how he'd initially resisted following in his father's footsteps, dreaming instead of adventure in far-off places, until a summer spent assisting with a cholera outbreak had shown him his true calling. How he'd courted a banker's daughter before leaving for medical school, only to return and find her married to another. How he'd nursed his father through his final illness, promising to continue caring for the people of Sweetwater Creek. "I never regretted coming back," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch behind the practice, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "This is where I belong." There was something in his tone that made Theodora glance at him, finding his eyes already on her, warm with an emotion she was afraid to name. "I'm glad you came back," she said softly. "Sweetwater Creek needs you." "And now it has you as well," he replied, his hand finding hers on the porch railing. "I can't imagine the practice without you now, Theodora." The touch of his fingers against hers sent a flutter through her chest. It would be so easy to let herself fall for this kind, intelligent man. So easy and so dangerous. Because to truly love someone was to trust them with your whole self, secrets and all. And Theodora's secrets were too dark, too damning to share. Before she could respond, the sound of galloping hooves broke the evening quiet. A rider was approaching fast, his horse lathered with sweat. "Doc," the man called out as he reined in his mount. "There's been an accident at the Miller Ranch. Barn roof collapsed. 2 men trapped, others injured." Isaac was on his feet in an instant. All traces of the tender moment vanished as he shifted into the focused position. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Mr. Miller sent me to fetch you while they try to free the trapped men. We'll need to bring supplies," Isaac said, turning to Theodora. "Bandages, laudanum, suture kits. I'll gather everything," she assured him, already moving toward the practice. Within minutes, they had packed their medical bags with essential supplies. Isaac helped Theodora onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins with the other hand. "Lead the way," he called to the messenger, and they set off at a gallop. The Miller Ranch was a 30-minute ride from town, but they made it in 20, pushing the horses hard. As they approached, Theodora could see lanterns illuminating the scene of the disaster, a large barn with one side partially caved in, men working frantically to remove debris. They dismounted quickly, and Isaac immediately took charge, assessing the situation with calm authority. "Theodora, see to the injured men over there," he directed, pointing to where several ranch hands sat or lay on the ground, being tended to by women from the household. "I'll check on the trapped men." The next hours were a blur of activity as they worked to treat the injured. Theodora cleaned and bandaged wounds, set a broken arm, and administered laudanum to those in the most pain. All the while, she kept one eye on Isaac, who was working with the ranch hands to free the 2 men trapped under fallen beams. When the first man was pulled free conscious, but badly hurt, Theodora rushed to assist. Together, she and Isaac worked to stabilize him, checking for internal injuries and treating a deep gash on his leg that had been bleeding heavily. "He needs surgery," Isaac murmured to her as they worked. "The leg wound is too deep, and I'm concerned about possible internal bleeding. We need to get him back to the practice." The second trapped man was in worse condition when they finally freed him unconscious, with multiple broken bones and a head injury that left his face covered in blood. As Isaac examined him, his expression grew grave. "We need a wagon," he called out to Mr. Miller. "Both men need to be transported to town immediately." While the wagon was being prepared, Theodora helped Isaac do what they could for the injured men. In the chaos and urgency of the situation, her shawl had slipped, and she was too focused on saving lives to notice. It wasn't until they had loaded the injured men into the wagon and were preparing to accompany them back to town that Isaac touched her arm, his voice low and concerned. "Theodora, you're hurt." She followed his gaze to her collarbone, where the scar was now fully visible in the lantern light. Her hand flew up to cover it, but it was too late. He had seen. "It's nothing," she said quickly, readjusting her shawl. "An old injury." Isaac's eyes met hers, filled with questions, but he didn't press the issue. "We should go. These men need immediate attention." The ride back to town was tense, both from concern for their patients and the unspoken questions hanging between them. By the time they reached the practice, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. They worked through the morning, performing surgery on the first man's leg and treating the second's multiple injuries. It was past noon when the immediate danger had passed and both men were stable, resting in beds set up in the waiting area. Exhausted, Theodora slumped into a chair, her hands stained with blood despite multiple washings. Isaac sat across from her, equally drained. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. Finally, Isaac broke the silence. "You were extraordinary tonight, Theodora. I couldn't have saved them without you." "We make a good team," she replied, managing a tired smile. "Yes, we do." He hesitated, then added gently, "About what I saw earlier." "I don't want to talk about it," she interrupted, the fear she'd been holding at bay suddenly surging forward. "All right," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture, "but if you ever do want to talk, I'm here." Theodora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The compassion in his eyes was almost her undoing. How would that compassion change to horror if he knew the truth behind her scar, if he knew what she had done? The next few days were consumed with caring for the injured ranch hands, leaving little time for personal conversations. Theodora was grateful for the distraction, for the excuse to keep interactions with Isaac focused on their patients rather than herself. But she could feel his concerned gaze following her when he thought she wasn't looking, could sense the questions he was restraining himself from asking. And she knew, with growing dread, that the fragile peace she had found in Sweetwater Creek was in jeopardy. 1 week after the barn collapse, with both men on the mend and the practice settling back into its normal routine, Isaac approached her as she was preparing to retire for the evening. "Theodora," he said, his voice soft but determined, "would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to discuss." Her instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her apartment and the walls she had built around herself, but the earnestness in his eyes made refusal impossible. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. They walked in silence through the quiet streets of Sweetwater Creek, eventually finding themselves at the small town park, where a bench overlooked a creek that gave the settlement its name. The evening was pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and distant rainfall. Isaac gestured to the bench and Theodora sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He joined her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this," he began, staring out at the creek. "And I'm not sure there is one, so I'll just speak plainly. I care for you, Theodora, more than as a colleague or friend." Her heart, which had been racing with anxiety, skipped a beat for an entirely different reason. "In the months you've been here," he continued, "you've become essential to me, to my practice, yes, but more importantly, to my life. Your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, I admire everything about you." "Isaac," she whispered, his name catching in her throat. He turned to face her, his blue eyes intense with emotion. "I know there's something in your past that troubles you, something you're not ready to share. I respect that. I'm not asking for your secrets, Theodora. I'm asking for a chance to show you that whatever happened before, whatever brought you to Sweetwater Creek, it doesn't change how I feel about you." Tears welled in Theodora's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "You don't know what you're saying," she said, her voice barely audible. "If you knew the truth, then tell me," he urged gently. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." The kindness in his voice was her undoing. The story she had carried alone for so long spilled out, haltingly at first, then in a rush of painful memories. "I worked for Dr. William Richard in St. Louis for 3 years, she began, her eyes fixed on the flowing creek rather than Isaac's face. "He was respected, admired. People said I was fortunate to learn from him, and I was at first. He was brilliant if demanding." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the harder truths. But he had another side, one he kept hidden from the public. He was cruel to patients he deemed unworthy, dismissive of anyone he considered beneath him. And he had improper interests in the young women who worked for him. Isaac's hand tightened on the bench beside her, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "I managed to avoid his advances for a long time, making excuses, never being alone with him when possible. But one night I had to stay late to prepare medicines for a patient with pneumonia. Dr. Richard had been drinking. He cornered me in his office." Theodora's hand moved unconsciously to her collarbone, tracing the scar beneath her blouse. "When I rejected him, he became enraged, said no one refused him, especially not a nobody like me. He had a scalpel. He said he'd mark me so no decent man would ever want me." Her voice faltered, the memory still vivid despite the passage of time. "I fought back. There was a struggle. The scalpel had ended up in his chest. I didn't mean to kill him, Isaac. It was an accident, self-defense. But who would believe me, a respected doctor or his assistant?" Finally, she forced herself to look at him, expecting to see horror or disgust. Instead, his expression was one of controlled fury, not directed at her, she realized, but on her behalf. "So you ran," he said quietly. She nodded. "I took what money I had saved, left that night. I've been afraid ever since that someone would recognize me, that the authorities would find me. The papers reported it as a murder, said I was a jealous employee who became violent when rejected. That's why you came to Sweetwater Creek, why you've been so careful about your past. Yes. She wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Now you understand why we can't, why there can't be anything between us. I'm a fugitive, Isaac, a killer according to the law. If anyone discovered the truth, stop, he interrupted firmly, taking her hands in his. What happened was self-defense, Theodora. Dr. Richard attacked you. You protected yourself. That doesn't make you a killer. But the law isn't always just, he said, his grip tightening on her hands, especially for women. You did what you had to do to survive, and then you came here and used your skills to help others. That's the woman I've come to know, compassionate, brave, dedicated to healing. Fresh tears spilled down Theodora's cheeks, his unwavering support overwhelming after so long spent carrying her burden alone. How can you still look at me like that, knowing what I've done? Isaac reached up, his touch gentle as he traced the line of her jaw. Because what happened in St. Louis doesn't define you. It's a wound, yes, but wounds heal. They leave scars, but scars are just evidence that you survived something difficult. Slowly, with infinite tenderness, his fingers moved to the collar of her blouse, pausing there in silent question. After a moment's hesitation, Theodora nodded, giving him permission. He carefully folded back the fabric, revealing the scar that curved along her collarbone, a pale line against her skin, permanent evidence of Dr. Richard's cruelty and her own desperate fight for survival. Isaac traced the scar with his fingertip, his touch so gentle it brought fresh tears to her eyes. This doesn't make you broken or damaged, Theodora, he said softly. It makes you a survivor. It's part of your story, part of what brought you to me. How could I see it as anything but beautiful? A sob escaped her at his words, years of shame and fear crumbling in the face of his acceptance. Isaac pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried, his hand stroking her back in soothing motions. I've been so afraid, she whispered against his chest. So alone. You're not alone anymore, he promised. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. When her tears subsided, Theodora pulled back slightly, looking up at Isaac with newfound hope. Do you really believe that we could have a future despite everything? I do, he said with conviction. Sweetwater Creek is a small town, far from the reach of St. Louis authorities. The people here know you now, respect you. Even if someone did discover your past, they'd stand by you. And you, would you truly be willing to tie your life to someone with such a shadow hanging over them? In answer, Isaac leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both gentle and certain. Theodora froze for an instant, then melted into the embrace, her arms winding around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. Does that answer your question? She laughed softly, a sound of wonder and joy. I believe it does. They walked back to the practice hand in hand, the weight that had pressed on Theodora's shoulders for so long finally beginning to lift. The future was still uncertain, the past still a potential threat, but for the first time since that fateful night in St. Louis, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by fear, a life shared with someone who saw her scars, both physical and emotional, and called them beautiful. The following months were the happiest of Theodora's life. Her relationship with Isaac deepened as they continued working side by side, their professional partnership enhanced rather than complicated by their personal connection. The people of Sweetwater Creek, far from judging their doctor's romance with his assistant, seemed delighted by the development, often expressing approval with knowing smiles or small gifts left at the practice. Theodora still wore high-necked blouses most days, the habit too ingrained to break entirely, but with Isaac she no longer felt the need to hide. In private moments, he would often trace the scar with gentle fingers or lips, a tender reminder of his acceptance of every part of her. Their courtship progressed with the steady assurance of two people who had already seen each other at their most vulnerable, and found strength in that shared vulnerability. Isaac proposed on a crisp autumn evening, presenting her with his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that matched his eyes. I know we haven't known each other long by conventional standards, he said as they stood in the garden behind the practice, the harvest moon illuminating his earnest face. "But I feel as though I've been waiting for you my entire life. Will you marry me, Theodora? Be my wife, my partner in all things." "Yes," she answered without hesitation, joy bubbling up within her like a spring. "Yes, Isaac." They were married in the small church of Sweetwater Creek a month later, with the entire town turning out to celebrate. Theodora wore a gown of cream-colored silk with a modest neckline, her honey-brown hair adorned with wildflowers. Isaac couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him, his smile so bright it rivaled the candles illuminating the church. Their vows were simple but profound, promises to stand by each other through whatever life might bring. As they sealed their commitment with a kiss, Theodora felt the last remnants of her old fear dissolving in the warmth of their shared love. The practice continued to thrive under their joint care, with Theodora taking on more responsibilities as Isaac taught her additional medical skills. They converted the apartment above the practice into a larger living space, making room for the family they both hoped to have. It was during the winter of their first year of marriage that the past Theodora had tried so hard to outrun finally caught up with them. The man arrived on the afternoon stage, a well-dressed stranger who stood out among the usual travelers to Sweetwater Creek. Theodora was alone in the practice, Isaac having ridden out to a distant ranch to deliver a baby when the bell above the door announced a visitor. She looked up from her inventory of medicines with a welcoming smile that froze on her face as recognition dawned. Standing before her was Edward Phelps, Dr. Richard's brother-in-law and a prominent attorney in St. Louis. "Well," he said, his thin lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "If it isn't Theodora Russell, or should I say the murderer who killed my sister's husband." Terror gripped Theodora, so intense she could barely breathe. "Mr. Phelps," she managed, her voice remarkably steady despite the panic flooding her veins. "What brings you to Sweetwater Creek, Justice?" he replied, removing his gloves with deliberate slowness. "It's taken me a long time to track you down, Miss Russell. You covered your tracks well. But a description in a medical journal caught my attention, a case study written by one Dr. Isaac Patterson, mentioning his skilled assistant's innovative treatment for a snakebite victim. The details matched techniques William had developed. He stepped closer, and Theodora resisted the urge to back away, standing her ground despite her fear. "I made inquiries, had a sketch artist create your likeness from descriptions. And here you are, playing at respectability while my sister mourns her husband." "Your sister knew what kind of man he was," Theodora said, finding courage in the truth she had carried for so long. She knew about his cruelty, his proclivities toward young women in his employ. Phelps's face darkened with anger. "How dare you slander a dead man? William was respected, admired. He tried to kill me," she interrupted, her hand going to her scar. "What happened that night was self-defense, not murder. A convenient claim from a woman who fled rather than face justice." His eyes narrowed. "I've already sent word to the authorities in St. Louis. They'll be dispatching officers to bring you back for trial." The room seemed to tilt around Theodora, her carefully built new life crumbling before her eyes. All she could think of was Isaac, how this would affect him, how the scandal would damage his reputation in the town he'd served his entire life. "You've made yourself quite comfortable here," Phelps continued, glancing around the practice. "Married the local doctor, I understand. Does he know he's harboring a fugitive? A killer?" Before Theodora could respond, the door opened again, and Samuel Briggs from the general store entered, his friendly expression shifting to concern as he sensed the tension in the room. "Everything all right, Mrs. Patterson?" he asked, his eyes moving between Theodora and the stranger. "Everything's fine, Mr. Briggs," she replied, forcing a smile. "This gentleman was just leaving." Phelps's mouth tightened, but he recognized the disadvantage of continuing the confrontation with a witness present. "Indeed. But I'll be staying at the hotel, Miss Russell. We have much more to discuss." After he departed, Samuel approached the counter, his brow furrowed with worry. "Who was that, Theodora? He seemed to upset you." "Just someone from my past," she said, her mind racing. "Nothing to concern yourself with." But as soon as Samuel left with his purchase of cough syrup for his wife, Theodora locked the practice door and sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. Phelps would not rest until she was arrested and returned to St. Louis to stand trial for Dr. Richard's death. A trial she would likely lose, given the respected doctor's standing and her flight from justice. She could run again, leave Sweetwater Creek and Isaac behind, disappear into another remote town under yet another identity. The thought made her physically ill. How could she abandon the life they had built together, the future they had planned? But how could she stay, knowing her presence would bring scandal and shame to Isaac's door? He believed in her innocence, but would the rest of the world? Would his practice survive if his wife was labeled a murderess? By the time Isaac returned that evening, tired but jubilant from the successful delivery of twins, Theodora had made her decision. She met him at the door, taking his medical bag and helping him remove his coat, storing away the memory of these simple domestic actions. "How was your day?" he asked, pulling her into an embrace. "Any exciting cases while I was gone?" "Isaac," she said, unable to maintain the pretense of normalcy, "something's happened." She told him everything: Phelps's arrival, his accusations, the imminent threat of arrest. Isaac's expression darkened as she spoke, his jaw tightening with anger. "So you see," she concluded, tears threatening despite her resolve to be strong, "I have to leave. Tonight before the authorities arrive. I can't drag you into this, can't let your reputation be destroyed because of me." "No," Isaac said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I won't let you run again, Theodora. This ends here." "Isaac, please, there's no other way." "There is," he insisted. "We fight this, together as we promised each other. You are innocent of murder. Dr. Richard attacked you and you defended yourself. It's time the truth was known." "But who would believe me over the word of a respected doctor's family? It would be my word against theirs." "Not necessarily." Isaac's eyes lit with sudden determination. "You said there were other women before you, other assistants who left abruptly. We can find them, ask them to come forward with their experiences." Hope, fragile but persistent, began to stir within Theodora. "Even if we could, it would take time we don't have if Phelps has already sent for the authorities." "Then we buy time," Isaac said, pacing the room as he thought aloud. "Phelps is staying at the hotel. Good, I'll speak with him, explain that any attempt to forcibly remove you from Sweetwater Creek will face resistance. This town protects its own, Theodora, and you are one of us now." The next morning, before the practice opened, Isaac went to confront Phelps at the hotel. Theodora waited anxiously, alternating between prayer and preparation for what might come. She had packed a small bag just in case, but Isaac's conviction had kindled a spark of defiance within her. Perhaps it was time to stop running, to stand and fight for the truth. When Isaac returned, his expression was grim but determined. "Phelps is unmoved. He's determined to see you brought to trial, convinced of your guilt, but I've bought us some time. Sheriff Jenkins has agreed not to act on any arrest warrant until we've had a chance to present our case." "Our case?" "I've sent telegrams to colleagues in St. Louis, asking them to locate former employees of Dr. Richard. And I've written to a lawyer friend from medical school who now practices in Denver. He's agreed to represent you if it comes to that." Theodora's eyes filled with tears at his unwavering support. "Isaac, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll trust me," he replied, cupping her face in his hands. "Trust us and what we've built here. I won't let them take you, Theodora, not without a fight." The next week was the most stressful of Theodora's life, worse even than the immediate aftermath of Dr. Richard's death. She continued working at the practice, refusing to hide away despite the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed her through town as rumors of Phelps's accusations spread. Isaac stood by her publicly, his hand firm on her back as they walked to church on Sunday, his voice steady as he introduced her as "my wife and partner" to patients. But in private moments, she could see the toll the situation was taking on him, the worry lines deepening around his eyes, the way he held her a little tighter each night as they lay in bed. 3 days after Phelps's arrival, a U.S. Marshal arrived from the territorial capital, carrying an arrest warrant from St. Louis. Sheriff Jenkins, true to his word, invited both the marshal and Phelps to his office to discuss the situation, along with Isaac and Theodora. "Here's how I see it," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "I've got a warrant from another jurisdiction for the arrest of a woman who's been a valued member of our community for nearly a year. A woman who's saved lives alongside our doctor, who's shown nothing but kindness and skill. And I've got serious questions about the circumstances that led to this warrant." "The circumstances are clear," Phelps interjected. "She murdered a respected physician and fled to avoid prosecution." "That's one version," Sheriff Jenkins replied mildly. "Dr. Patterson has presented another, that his wife acted in self-defense against a violent assault." The marshal, a weathered man with a gray mustache, studied Theodora thoughtfully. "Madam, would you be willing to return to St. Louis voluntarily to answer these charges? It would look better than being taken in chains." Before she could respond, the door to the sheriff's office opened, and Samuel Briggs entered, followed by a woman Theodora didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with a nervous but determined expression. "Sorry to interrupt, Sheriff," Samuel said, "but this lady just arrived on the stage, says she has information relevant to your discussion." The woman stepped forward, her chin raised despite her obvious anxiety. "My name is Clara Bennett. I worked for Dr. William Richard in St. Louis for 8 months in 1872 before Miss Russell, Mrs. Patterson now, I understand." Phelps stood abruptly. "This is irrelevant. Whatever grievances this woman may have, sit down, Mr. Phelps," the marshal ordered. "I'd like to hear what she has to say." Clara's testimony was delivered in a clear, steady voice that gained strength as she spoke. She described Dr. Richard's initially professional demeanor, how it had gradually changed to unwanted advances, then to threats when she rejected him. She had left St. Louis rather than endure his harassment, starting a new life in Denver where Isaac's lawyer friend had located her through medical community connections. "He told me no one would believe me over him," Clara concluded, looking directly at Phelps. "That if I spoke out, he would ruin me. I was a coward. I ran instead of fighting. But when I received word that another young woman faced prison for defending herself against him, I couldn't stay silent any longer." As she spoke, Phelps's face had grown increasingly pale. The marshal watched him closely, then turned to Theodora. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to show us the evidence of Dr. Richard's attack on you?" With trembling fingers, Theodora unbuttoned the high collar of her blouse, folding it back to reveal the scar along her collarbone. "He did this with a scalpel," she said quietly. "Said he would mark me so no decent man would ever want me." The sheriff swore under his breath, while the marshal's weathered face hardened. Only Phelps seemed unmoved, though his earlier confidence had clearly been shaken. "One woman's word might be dismissed," the marshal said, turning to him. "Two is harder to ignore, and physical evidence of an attack changes things considerably." "My sister deserves justice," Phelps insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Justice works both ways, Mr. Phelps," the marshal replied. "Based on what I've heard, I'm not convinced Mrs. Patterson would receive a fair trial in St. Louis, where your family's influence is considerable." He stood, reaching a decision. "I'm taking this warrant back to the territorial judge with a recommendation that it be dismissed due to compelling evidence of self-defense. In the meantime, Mrs. Patterson will remain free, but is asked not to leave the territory." Relief washed over Theodora in a wave so powerful she might have collapsed if Isaac hadn't been there, his arms strong around her waist. "Thank you," she whispered, tears of gratitude spilling down her cheeks. Phelps left Sweetwater Creek the next day, his mission unfulfilled. Clara Bennett stayed for a week, her presence a reminder to Theodora that she was not alone in her experience, not the only one who had suffered at Dr. Richard's hands. By the time Clara departed for Denver, the two women had formed a bond of shared understanding and mutual respect. 2 months later, a letter arrived from the territorial capital. The warrant for Theodora's arrest had been officially dismissed, the case closed due to compelling evidence of justifiable self-defense. She was free, truly free for the first time in years. That night, as she and Isaac sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, Theodora felt a peace she had thought would never be hers again. "What are you thinking?" Isaac asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "That I'm grateful," she replied honestly. "For this place, for Clara's courage, for the marshal's fairness. But mostly for you, Isaac. You never doubted me, never wavered." "How could I?" he said simply. "I know who you are, Theodora, not what happened in St. Louis, but who you are in your heart. That's what I fell in love with, what I'll always love." She leaned her head against his shoulder, savoring the solid warmth of him. "I used to think my scar was a mark of shame, a reminder of the worst night of my life. Now I see it differently." "How so?" "It led me here," she said softly. "To Sweetwater Creek, to you, to this life we're building together. In a strange way, it was the beginning of everything good." Isaac turned to face her, his expression tender in the fading light. "That's what I've been trying to tell you all along. Your past, even the painful parts, shaped the woman you are, the woman I love." His fingers traced the line of her jaw, then moved to the scar hidden beneath her collar. "Every part of you is beautiful to me, Theodora, every part." As his lips met hers in a kiss that spoke of acceptance, of enduring love, and of the future stretching bright before them, Theodora knew she had finally found her true home, not in a place, but in the heart of a man who saw her wounds and called them beautiful. 5 years later, Theodora stood on the same porch, watching as Isaac played with their children in the garden behind their expanded home. 4-year-old William, named not for Dr. Richard, but for Theodora's father, chased butterflies with the serious concentration only a child can muster, while 2-year-old Emily toddled after her father on unsteady legs, her laughter ringing out in the summer air. The practice had grown along with their family, now occupying a larger building in the center of town. Sweetwater Creek itself had expanded, the railroad bringing new settlers, new opportunities, and occasionally new challenges. Through it all, Isaac and Theodora had worked side by side, their medical partnership as strong as their marriage. Theodora's hand went absently to her collar, where the scar remained faded now with time but still present, a permanent part of her story. She no longer felt the need to hide it, though old habits sometimes persisted. The people of Sweetwater Creek knew her history now and had embraced her all the more for the strength she had shown in overcoming it. Clara Bennett had returned to visit twice, bringing news of other women who had suffered at Dr. Richard's hands, and found the courage to speak out after hearing Theodora's story. Together, they had created a network of support for women escaping difficult situations, a quiet alliance that had helped several young women start new lives in the expanding West. As for Edward Phelps, they had heard he had fallen from prominence in St. Louis society after his sister divorced her second husband amid rumors of impropriety with their housekeeper. The justice Phelps had so vehemently demanded for his brother-in-law had proven to be a double-edged sword, exposing uncomfortable truths about the family he had tried so hard to protect. "Mama, look," William called, holding up a particularly vibrant butterfly perched on his finger. "It's not scared of me." "That's because it knows you're gentle," Theodora replied, descending the porch steps to join her family. "Butterflies can sense kindness." Isaac looked up as she approached, his smile as warm and genuine as the day she had first met him. 7 years had added a few strands of silver to his dark hair, a few lines around his eyes, but to Theodora, he had only grown more handsome with time. "I was just telling the children about the new baby," he said, lifting Emily into his arms as she reached for him. "William has decided it should be a brother." Emily remains unconvinced. Theodora laughed, her hand moving to the slight swell of her belly beneath her dress. Their third child, due in winter, was already a subject of friendly debate among the family. "The baby will be whoever they are meant to be," she said, ruffling William's hair. "Just like all of us." As the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink, the Patterson family gathered on their porch, a tradition started in those early days when it had just been Isaac and Theodora, dreaming of the future that now surrounded them. William and Emily eventually nodded off, the excitement of the day giving way to exhaustion. Isaac carried them inside, tucking them into their beds with tender care before rejoining Theodora on the porch. "Happy?" he asked, taking her hand as they watched the first stars appear. "Completely," she answered without hesitation. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You know, when my father died, I thought my purpose was clear: to continue his work, to care for this town as he had. But then you arrived, and I realized my life was only beginning." "We've built something beautiful here," Theodora said, looking out at the town that had become their home, the community that had embraced them through challenges and celebrations alike. Isaac's fingers found her scar in the gathering darkness, tracing its path with the familiar tenderness that still made her heart flutter. "Yes," he agreed softly, "beautiful indeed." And in that moment, with her husband beside her and their children sleeping peacefully within, Theodora knew the truth of it. Her past, once a wound she had tried desperately to hide, had become part of a larger, more beautiful story, one of healing, of acceptance, and of a love that had seen beyond the scars to the strength that lay beneath.